Welcome to the Leader's Edge podcast. I'm your host, Chris Kolenda, retired Army Colonel, combat leader, author, and speaker. I work with leaders who want to create unshakable business endurance. So tune in as I translate powerful leadership lessons from the battlefield and apply them to your business. From Gettysburg and Normandy to your next biggest business challenges and opportunities, this podcast helps you gain the clarity, confidence, and competitive edge to steer with purpose and win decisively. Ready to sharpen your leadership? Let's dive in. Hi, my name is Chris Kolenda. I'm a retired Army Colonel, author, PhD, and I help leaders create unshakable business endurance for their organizations. Now, one of the things about great leaders that I've recognized, having worked with them for 35 years in the military and beyond, is they recognize the power and value of offsites, and particularly those offsites that get you outdoors in spectacular places, because what it does is it gets people to strengthen their relationships, build some trust, and gets them outside their comfort zone. So you have got much more open minds for the things that you want them to process and talk about. And then because of that and the emotional connection they've got with the place, it becomes an offsite that people draw from for many, many years, that continues to strengthen your relationships, speed your communication, and your innovation. So in this 5-part series, I'm going to bring you inside the Antietam Gettysburg leadership experience I call the Leader's Edge. So you're going to get a flavor for the kinds of themes that we can discuss on these battlefields and how it might impact your team. Today's theme is going to be about winning before the fighting even starts. How would your business change if you found yourself in an unbeatable position? That's exactly what we're going to discuss during this episode. I learned a bit about unbeatable positioning in Afghanistan, where I led a group of about 800 paratroopers in the mountains, the eastern part of the country. It's one of the deadliest places in Afghanistan in the summer of 2007. And our paratroopers have been winning every firefight. The problem is that the firefights kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So as many insurgents as we would kill or capture, they just seem to recruit more and more. So we're winning every battle. It became clear that we're losing the war. And we need to do something different. They had unbeatable positioning because they had popular support, and we did not. Now, we figured out that the fighters were locals, which meant that about 95% of the people who we thought we were helping were actually trying to kill us. Now, that also gave us an opening, because if the majority of the fighters were locals, they had to have public support. And so for us to try to gain unbeatable positioning, we had to gain public support. The enemy could afford to lose fighters all day long in multiple firefights, but what they could not afford to lose was public support. And so we began a strategy of building relationships with local elders, supporting them economically to achieve their objectives. The insurgents only offered violence and destruction, or we could offer them something very unique, which is the ability to achieve the objectives that they had for their community, for the common good of their people. And as we began working together with them on those objectives, the insurgents lost ground. And about 6 months later, the head insurgent leader from the biggest group in the area signed an agreement with the elders to stop fighting, and they eventually switched sides. So what that showed me was that, even highly talented people who were in a bad position look inept. Whereas even average people, when they are in a unbeatable position, look like geniuses. And Lincoln recognized this, as well as a number of commanders in the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg. And so let's dive into how they created unbeatable positioning and the strategies and visual models that you can use to create unbeatable positioning for your organization. So let's discuss unbeatable positioning in terms of the larger practical wisdom framework. So here's the practical wisdom framework, and I'm not going to have time on this video, of course, to go through every step of it. I'll do so in another one. When it comes to overall outcomes, what every business leader eventually wants is unshakable business endurance. Jim Collins called it being built to last. And that comes from three outcomes: unbeatable positioning, unwavering inspiration, and unstoppable workforce. So we're going to focus in this session about unbeatable positioning. And that comes at the intersection of disciplined foresight and empowering oversight. And when you look at disciplined foresight, we're going to discuss mostly today upstream thinking and how Lincoln used upstream thinking to turn the tables on the Confederacy. So that's where we're going to begin. Now, when it comes to unbeatable positioning, most organizations find themselves within one of four stages. When you look on the far left, in the red area, that's an organization in crisis management. And you constantly feel like you're in firefighting mode. And you do plenty of things well. You often feel you're getting fleeting results because of this sort of constant cycle of crises. And the myth that organizations who stay mired in crisis management often tell themselves is, hey, I work well under pressure. I do my best under pressure. And so they almost manufacture these crises for this adrenaline rush. And it means, with that mentality, that you'll never get out of the red zone. Now, certainly Abraham Lincoln in 1861 and 1862 had a lot of crises. Newly elected president, you get the Civil War beginning. He's just lost the first Battle of Bull Run. You have some disastrous campaigns in Virginia. Then you have the big loss at Second Bull Run. And now in September of 1862, Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army have invaded Maryland. So they've come into the North. So Lincoln is dealing with a lot of crises at this point. In order to get out of the crisis management mode, you have to focus on your processes. And the truth, if you will, of moving from red to amber is the process. Getting the process right is more important than fixating on the outcome. Because with the right processes, outcomes will eventually arise. But if you just simply focus on the outcome and you neglect the process, then oftentimes you're simply rewarding luck, and eventually you're gonna be circling the drain because you don't have the foundations in place to get consistently good outcomes. So productive processes are going to get you into the amber zone and through it, and it's going to feel like a hopeful grind that we're doing this right, we're going to get there, we're going to continue moving, and eventually you get into the point where you just simply expect excellence. And that's your light green zone. We've got a masterful model about how you are achieving your outcomes. You got a masterful model about a business model. In Afghanistan, it was a masterful model for how we did counterinsurgency. I mean, we were, even in the early days, while we're in all these big firefights, I mean, our tactical model was masterful. We were winning every single firefight. And we expected excellence. We expected to win every firefight. The challenge, though, and the myth that we had to get past was that our best practices were good enough. The problem with best practices is there's no way to get beyond a best practice. And so you start to get complacent and you start believing your own press. You stop looking for ways to innovate. And the mentality that we had to break through was that these best practices in the existing counterinsurgency model were good enough. And so the truth is, we needed to embrace novelty. We needed to figure out a way to change the game in order to get into durable success. And once we found the right novelty, then of course the challenge was to scale it. And thanks to the great work of our paratroopers on the ground, we were able to do that. Now, this is also what Lincoln was able to do in 1862. So Lincoln is dealing with all of these crises. In fact, let me go to a picture of Lincoln. Lincoln is dealing with all of these different crises that I mentioned. And he had framed the war up to that point as a war to preserve the Union. And in fact, on slavery, he said, if I could preserve the Union by abolishing slavery, I would abolish slavery. If I could preserve the Union by maintaining slavery, I would maintain slavery. So the number one interest for him as president was maintaining the Union, restoring the Union. Now, Lincoln had always been an abolitionist, and the sentiment that he was expressing about the primacy of putting the Union back together, putting the country back together, was what was politically sustainable at the time. But because he framed the war that way, many European powers were looking at the war and saying, well, maybe we should recognize the Confederacy. It'd be great to take this massive American country down a notch, be able to do a little bit of divide and conquer. They could continue getting cotton from the South. They would have another trading partner, and they would have a balance against this growing American behemoth. Lincoln recognized this danger. And as he began to think upstream, think, how do I get ahead of this? Because right now I'm behind the eight ball. I'm in crisis management. I'm losing battles. I'm losing the diplomatic, or I'm at risk of losing the diplomatic struggle for keeping the Confederacy isolated. And so how do I change the game? And of course, the answer was in the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, Lincoln had worked on the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862, had it all ready to go, and was going to issue it on the heels of the big disaster for the Union at Second Bull Run. And his Secretary of State, William Seward, said, Mr. President, I don't think it's a great idea to issue this now because it's going to look like we're desperate. We need to issue this on the heels of a victory, and that will give us the momentum that we need. And so Lincoln agreed, understood the logic, and he waited for a victory. And that victory was going to come in 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. It was a tactical draw, but Lee was forced to retreat. And so it became a strategic win for the Union. Lincoln, on the heels of the battle, issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and all of the European powers who were very close, they were even debating in their parliaments and their assemblies about whether to recognize the Confederacy or not. As soon as Lincoln reframed the war from preserve the Union to abolish slavery, all the European powers abandoned any idea of recognizing the Confederacy because they had all outlawed slavery. And to recognize the Confederacy as a country that built its foundation of legitimacy on maintaining the institution of slavery, they couldn't possibly do that. And so all the European powers abandoned the Confederacy, and it was the strategic turning point in the war. So let's talk about what Lincoln did and how we as leaders can adopt upstream thinking. And you can use this double axis chart to map out upstream versus downstream thinking. So I'm going to label this upstream thinking. And when you look at this double axis chart, you have some challenges that happen in the past and some that may happen in the future. So past, future is the east-west axis. And then you have some challenges that you face are causal, and some are the effect of a cause. So if you imagine a house with a leaky roof, for example, if you have a hole in the roof and there's a rainstorm, you are going to get water on your ceiling. And so the cause of that is the hole in the roof. The effect is the spreading stain on your ceiling. And so there's the distinction there. So continuing the analogy, when you have a leaky roof, the cause is a hole in the roof, then what you do to fix that cause is what's called corrective action. In this case, you fix the hole in the roof. Now you've also got to deal with the stain on the ceiling. So the remedy for that past problem, fixing the stain, would be remedial action. Now, because these all happened in the past, they're to the right of the boom, so to speak, these are both examples of downstream thinking. Because they are after the fact. There we go, downstream thinking. Because you're taking action after the fact. Now, of course, what you really want to do is get upstream. That is, you want to prevent problems from happening in the first place because it's much less expensive. Fire prevention is much less expensive than firefighting and fire remediation. And so when you look to prevent a cause, something from happening in the future, of course you call that preventive or preventative. I'm going to use preventive action. You do fire inspections as a preventative action in your home, in your business building, etc. Now, to prevent the effect of a fire, in this case, that might happen in the future, you have fire insurance. So this would be an example of a contingent action or a contingency. You develop contingencies in case something bad happens so that you're positioned to respond very quickly and at the least possible cost. Now, what Lincoln did is very interesting. If these four deal with problems, you also have opportunity. And you can use this same matrix, if you will, to discuss actions about opportunity. So when you are looking to create a cause, a favorable cause in the future, that would be called shaping actions. So Lincoln did a shaping action by creating the Emancipation Proclamation and starting to get senior level political support for the proclamation. And he framed it as a wartime contingency matter. And so he was able to get political support for the Emancipation Proclamation. And then what he did once he issued it was he had already planned exploiting actions. So he was able to exploit the success of the Emancipation Proclamation by keeping the European powers out of the war and also solidifying support within the North, eventually for the 13th and 14th Amendments, which were going to end slavery. So this is an example of how Lincoln used upstream thinking, in particular shaping and exploiting opportunities to seize the initiative and put himself and the Union in an unbeatable position. Of course, there were lots of fighting to go, years of fighting to go after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Confederacy, though, was clearly on a, or I guess in hindsight, at that point, the Confederacy is on the downswing. So when we look at business, we can use a similar chart for upstream thinking. So we have plenty of corrective and remedial action. All that's downstream. The challenge is, how do we get upstream? And these four categories, thinking through preventive actions to prevent problems from happening, contingent actions, creating contingencies so that we are able to respond when problems happen, and then even more importantly is looking at opportunities. How do we shape and then how do we exploit opportunities in the future? And those are some of the things that we discuss on the Antietam and Gettysburg battlefields. So what are the best opportunities that you can shape and exploit in a volatile marketplace? A second terrific example of upstream thinking is General John Buford on day one of Gettysburg. So Buford was the cavalry commander for the Union, and he was following General Lee's movements as he moved into Pennsylvania. So Buford is looking for a great place for the Union to defend. And he sees where the cavalry he sees where the Confederate forces are starting to converge at a bunch of road intersections. Town was called Gettysburg. Now, outside of Gettysburg is this massive ridgeline known as Cemetery Ridge. And Buford, got a picture of him here, Buford recognizes that this is an unbeatable position. If the Union forces can occupy this high ground in force, it is unbeatable. And so Buford knew that in order for the infantry to get on the high ground, he had to give them some space. So Buford moves forward, creates this arc of cavalry around the town of Gettysburg, and dismounts his cavalrymen. They've got repeating rifles, which most of the Civil War infantry had muzzle-loading muskets. Well, these have breech-loading repeating rifles. They look like a force about 4 or 5 times their size in terms of firepower. And Buford, on his own initiative, sets up on a place called McPherson Ridge, and he sends a courier back to his boss, General Reynolds, the nearest infantry corps commander, and says, hey, I got the high ground. I know exactly where we need to defend. I need you to get up with your corps now so we can hold the Confederates off before they seize the dominant ground. Buford held on for the entire morning. Eventually, Reynolds' corps came up, and they delayed the Confederates long enough at day one at Gettysburg that allowed the Union forces to occupy Cemetery Ridge and a place called Little Round Top, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. They occupied Cemetery Ridge, and for the next 2 days, the Confederates impaled themselves on the Union defenses at Cemetery Ridge, ultimately lost the battle, and proved a massive defeat for the Confederates. So going back to our chart about upstream thinking, this is exactly what Buford is doing. He is looking for opportunities. So he sees that if he allows the Confederates to take the high ground, Cemetery Ridge, he's automatically into corrective and remedial action. But he's thinking ahead. He's thinking upstream. He says, how can we, first of all, prevent the Confederates from getting that high ground? And so he deploys forward, and he's also shaping the opportunity for the Union to seize it by sending the courier to Reynolds, operating on his own initiative to essentially select the ground that his boss's boss is going to have to fight from. because Meade, who was the Union commander, wanted to fight from a totally different place. Buford saw this was the key ground. And so he shaped the opportunity, and Meade recognized the opportunity sufficiently to occupy the ground and exploit it. And that is a major reason why the battle at Gettysburg is won. And so, what are some things that you're doing in your business to promote upstream thinking, to empower people like John Buford to be able to recognize, shape, and then exploit opportunities that advance your business? Now, of course, within your organization, you've got to continually reinforce the upstream thinking, and particularly the shaping and exploiting of opportunities until it becomes a habit, because it may not necessarily be a natural act, and people can backslide into just simply preventive and contingent action if they're not actively thinking forward about opportunities. This is exactly what happened on day 3 of Gettysburg. General George Meade, who's pictured here, was the overall Union commander, and he had just been put in command. He was a corps commander, so a subordinate commander for the up to that point in the war, and very, very effective. This is his first time ever leading the Army of the Potomac, and this is a force of about 100,000 soldiers. This is a massive organization. And Meade naturally is going to be fairly cautious. He's getting to know his role. He's getting to know his staff. And then he's got Buford, who sees and seizes this opportunity. And to Meade's credit, he recognizes that this is something he needs to exploit. And so he does it. And now it's day 3 of Gettysburg. And Lee had, on day 2, had tried to attack up at Little Round Top with Joshua Chamberlain. We'll talk about him in a bit. And it was unsuccessful. And so Lee now decides that he is going to send Pickett's charge, so his strike force, into the center of the Union line, believing that day 1, the Union was strong on one side. Day 2, they were strong on the other side. They must be weak in the middle. So he's going to send Pickett and his 20,000 soldiers or so over a mile of open ground into the teeth of the Union defenses, and he's counting on them to break the Union defenses. Well, Meade had clearly thought through the preventive actions. So he wants to prevent a penetration of his line. So he reinforces the center, which is the most open and most vulnerable area, with new cannon, with more infantry. He even has contingent action because he places a reserve behind them, knowing that if there's going to be a penetration, it's likely there. So he has a fresh corps ready to move forward and stop any breach from happening. So he's thought through the preventive and contingent action, but what he didn't do was think through the shaping and exploiting action. So what if we're successful? What if Lee impales himself on our defenses and he's forced to retreat? What do we do? So in many ways, the shaping was sort of happening by force of circumstance, but he was not in a position to exploit. So when Pickett's charge hits the high water mark and they're defeated and all those forces begin retreating, Meade's forces were, on one hand, so elated that they actually won the battle that they were more focused on celebrating the victory. But what Meade didn't do is think through, okay, if I'm successful, how do I exploit this victory? Can I take my cavalry and send them around Lee to secure the bridges so Lee can't get back across into Virginia? Can I interdict Lee's supply lines? What can I do to bottle him up? Because potentially, with a big enough victory, Meade might even be able to win the war. He hadn't been thinking like that. And as a result, Lee was able to escape back through the Shenandoah Valley back into Virginia and live to fight on for almost another 2 years. So the key question for business leaders is, what is your routine? What is your rhythm for encouraging people to think upstream, both preventive and contingent action, and also shaping and exploiting action? So how do you do that? Do you do that during your quarterly business reviews? How do you help people have the psychological confidence that they can offer these sort of fresh ideas and offer this upstream thinking without feeling like they're going to get cut off at the knees or somehow disrespected? So those are some vital questions that business leaders can answer, that you can answer, in order to promote more upstream thinking within your organization. Now, a final lesson on upstream thinking comes from General Robert E. Lee. And one of the challenges, so a final lesson on upstream thinking comes from General Robert E. Lee. Now, the biggest challenge he had at Gettysburg was he was essentially fighting blind. His cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, normally very reliable, exceptionally good at providing Lee with information about the whereabouts and intentions of the enemy. Stuart had been humiliated, he felt, at the end of the Battle of Chancellorsville. His force lost an encounter to the Union cavalry. And so Stuart's a little upset by that. And he decided that he wanted to resurrect his reputation. And he wanted to do so by riding around the Union Army, which he had done this previously and gathered all sorts of headlines and destroyed a lot of Union supplies and things like that. And so he thought he could do Lee a great service by riding around. And so he started south of the Union forces and then was going to circle them to the east and eventually rejoin Lee up in Pennsylvania. Now, the challenge is that as 100,000 federal forces are uncoiling and moving north to meet Lee, the column's getting longer and longer and longer. And so Stuart's got to go further and further and further to try to get around the Union Army. And he's not able to do it in time. Really doesn't join up with Lee until July 2nd. So the evening of the second day of the battle. And so Lee is fighting blind. He has no idea where the Union forces are. He believes that they've moved, but he doesn't have any reliable information. And meanwhile, he's got his different corps separated. And it's not until just before July 1st that Lee gets a reliable report that the Union Army is actually heading towards Gettysburg. So he's got to orient all of his forces onto Gettysburg to try to get there first. So Lee, when we go back to our diagram, Lee is in constant state of corrective and remedial action because he didn't have the information he needed, didn't have the reconnaissance information he needed to be able to do preventive and ideally for him, shaping and exploiting action. So he's into corrective action. He's got to figure out how does he get his forces consolidated. He's into remedial action because on day one, there's a big firefight that he didn't expect. And so now he's got to rejigger his forces. They're not quite lined up the way he wants them to. And so Lee is constantly in crisis management. He's constantly in firefighting mode throughout the Battle of Gettysburg. And I wonder to what extent that affected his psyche. Because the day 3 attack that he orders, Pickett's charge, is a very low probability of success. And it may have been a combination of Lee breathing his own exhaust and also an after effect, a symptom of just exhaustion after all of this crisis management and frustration over the first 2 days of the battle. So for business leaders, a couple of key questions emerge from this. The first one is, are we encouraging disciplined initiative? So we saw 2 examples of initiative during this program. The first one was General John Buford, the Union cavalry commander, who was tracking Lee's forces, saw where the decisive, unbeatable position was, and he took initiative to get the Union Army to occupy that. So this is disciplined initiative. This is initiative that is designed for the common good. Stuart, however, was engaged in undisciplined initiative, which you might call freelancing. And by riding around the Union Army, he's not operating in the common good. He is not helping Lee at all. And in fact, he leaves Lee blind. So putting the right boundaries around initiative so people are able to advance the common good and not detract from it is absolutely vital. And in further episodes, we'll talk a little bit about delegation and exactly how you create discipline initiatives so people have the freedom to experiment and innovate, and you have the confidence that it's going to advance the common good and not detract from it. Thanks for tuning in to the Leader's Edge podcast. If you found today's episode valuable, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review because it helps more leaders like you find their edge. Do you want to take these lessons further? Well, you can visit my website, chriskolenda.com, for resources, support, and adventure offsites that build unbeatable positioning, help you create an unstoppable workforce, and give you the tools for unwavering inspiration. Until next time, stay decisive, stay inspired, and keep leading from the front.